This is Duke University.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to have all of you all here this afternoon. I will remind you that this is the last FERG of the fall semester, that we will have more starting in the spring, leading off with Chris Exley, the head of Atlantic Philanthropies, starting on January the 28th, and then going through Hillary Pennington, Vice President of the Ford Foundation. In February, Will Miller, the President of the Wallace Funds. At the end of February, Christine Morse, the head of the Margaret Cargill Philanthropies in March, and Russell Hardin, the President of the Woodruff Foundations in Atlanta, starting on April the 1st. That's the lineup for the spring, and I hope that as many of you all can come will do so. But today, our business is to hear from Stephen Heintz. He and I are going to have a conversation in front of you, and we will. But before we do that, and before I introduce him, I'd like to go around the table and ask everyone, as we usually do, and around the chairs too, those of you who are here to identify yourselves, so that Stephen will know to whom he will be speaking. Well, thank you all for coming. As you know, our guest is Stephen Heintz, who is the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And before joining RBF, he has been in leadership positions in both the nonprofit sector and in the public sector. Most recently, he was the founding president of Demos, which is a network for ideas in action, which some of you have heard about. Before going to Demos, he worked as executive vice president and chief operating officer of the East-West Institute, where he worked on issues of economic reform, civil society development, and international security, which is based in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and he was there for 7 years, very critical time from 1990 to 1997, where he worked throughout Central and Eastern Europe and helped develop democracy in those states. He was in politics in Connecticut, in government service, where he served as Commissioner of Economic Development, Commissioner of Social Welfare, and in 1988 he helped draft and secure passage by Congress of the Family Support Act, which is the first major effort to reform the nation's welfare system. I said to him, I've said this before, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is a comparatively small foundation by US foundation standards. It surprises everybody to know that its asset base is less than $1 billion. And yet, if you ask people which foundations they respect a great deal and the judgment of which they often follow, they will mention the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And so I think that it says something about the fund, the family, the traditions of the family, and that foundation, that it has the stature that it does. I was kidding with Stephen earlier today. When I first went to work at Atlantic Philanthropies in 1993, people kept coming up to me and saying, you remember, you don't remember, probably most of you, that Atlantic Philanthropy did everything it did anonymously. So nobody knew about it in the first place. And those who knew about it thought, well, maybe they would say, is the money behind the Atlantic Philanthropies the Rockefeller money? Why? Because our executive director, then Ray Hanlon, my predecessor, was seen often over at room 5600 in the Rockefeller Center, where the Rockefeller family offices were. Well, and the reason for that is very clear. It had nothing to do with the money coming from Rockefeller family to Atlantic Philanthropies. That, we all know now, was money that was given by Chuck Feeney, the co-founder of Duty Free Shops. The reason was because my predecessor and our trustees felt that we had a lot to learn from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Rockefeller family about how to do philanthropy. And I think that's a generally held view in philanthropy today. It's often in a leadership position. So to launch the conversation, Stephen, I thought I'd ask you to say just a little bit, for those who aren't familiar with the structure of Rockefeller Philanthropies, the family, say a little bit about it. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund is just one of the organizations that the family has created. Say a little bit about about why it was founded, and also what the other entities are around that bear the Rockefeller name, so that give people a little context.
Sure. Thank you, Joel, and thank you very much for having me here, and thanks to all of you for coming out for this conversation. I really appreciate it very, very much. And I look forward to your questions as well as Joel's. So this is a marvelous story, actually, in American history. And it all starts, of course, with John D. Rockefeller himself, who was America's first billionaire. He had a wealth of $1 billion accumulated by 1916. And in today's dollars, that would be about $30 billion. And that was not the end of his accumulation of wealth. That was just when he achieved that particular milestone. And as everybody knows, John D. Rockefeller also started to give away his vast wealth really from the very beginning. We have actually in the Rockefeller Archive Center his little ledger book from the year 1855 when he first went to work at the age of 16, having grown up in a very modest family. And he went to work and he kept a very detailed ledger of all of his income and all of his expenditures. And in that first year he made $45. And he gave $5 to various charitable causes. So he was already giving, more than 10% of his income, even at age 16, to things that needed his support or that he felt deserved his support. And that tradition is what has driven the whole history of Rockefeller family philanthropy. So he and his son, John D. Jr., really worked hard to find what they thought of as a scientific way of giving away the vast wealth that had been created. And the first thing they did was to create the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. And along with the Carnegie Corporation of New York, these two are really the original modern American foundations, founded more or less at the same time. And they were very active, John D. Sr. and Jr., in the first years of the Rockefeller Foundation, working on medical issues, healthcare, education, and other things, trying to go to the root causes of social problems rather than the more traditional charitable approach of providing relief from the symptoms of social problems. John D. Jr. had 5 sons and a daughter, and as they were coming of age in the late 1930s, he encouraged them to begin to get serious about philanthropy. They too were obviously going to be very wealthy at some point, and he wanted them to understand the moral responsibility of that wealth. And so it was in 1940 that he encouraged the brothers. The sister was not so interested in philanthropy. She was more interested in social affairs at that point.
Abby O'Neill?
Well, it was her mother, Abby Rockefeller, who then became married a guy named Mose and had a daughter named Abby O'Neill, who married a guy named O'Neill, who has been very active with us in any case. So the sons were encouraged by their father to get serious. And this was obviously right before the war. They all went off in various ways to serve the country. When they came back, they really got serious about philanthropy. And at the beginning, it was kind of like just an informal giving circle where they would sit down together and say, well, I'm giving to this, what are you giving to? And try not to get solicitations from the same organization and make separate grants and those kinds of things. And as they got into it, they began to see that they wanted to also focus more on trying to address the roots of problems. And their father continued to encourage them, and he set up the endowment for the foundation. In 1953, he made the first gift to the endowment, and he required them to contribute to it as well. And so it was really an intentional parental effort to pass on the traditions and the values and the legacy of his and his father's approach to philanthropy, and that's how the RBF got started.
But there are other affiliated philanthropies as well.
So then the fourth generation, who are known as the cousins, who are now in their 60s and 70s, as they were coming of age in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they too wanted to have a foundation to reflect the values of their time and the interests of that generation, and so they started something called the Rockefeller Family Fund, which is in asset size considerably smaller than the RBF, which is considerably smaller than the Rockefeller Foundation. But each of them have been vehicles through which successive generations of this family have been able to work together in philanthropy. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation is really no longer directly affiliated with the family. David Rockefeller Jr. is the current chair of the board, but he's the only member of the board. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, on the other hand, is very much the family's premier philanthropic institution, and half of our board of trustees are members of the Rockefeller family. The Rockefeller Family Fund, which now is 5th and 6th generation Rockefellers, is all family members on the board.
If I remember correctly, you said that some of the members of the current trustees of the foundation are from the 4th and 5th generation.
That's right.
Together.
That's right. In fact, we elected the first chair of our board from the 5th generation in June of last year, 2013, and that's Valerie Rockefeller Wayne, who happens to be the daughter of Senator J. Rockefeller.
Is there any competition among the several branches, the 6 branches of the family, for being trustees of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, or being the chair of the fund?
I wouldn't say there's competition between the branches. There is competition between individuals. The David Rockefeller branch has been extremely active at the RBF. Even though he was the youngest of the brothers, he was 25 when the foundation was started, and because he was the kid, he was the recording secretary. And we have all of his notes of board meetings of those days that David Rockefeller kept. He, of course, is the only surviving brother. He's now 99 years old and still traveling the world and still involved with us in marvelous ways. And his branch has been, I would say, the most active, along with the O'Neills, which comes from the sister, as you noted earlier. Those two have been the most active. The John III line, which Valerie, our current chair, represents, has been a little less active. The Winthrop line, not very active at all.
They have their own foundation.
They have a small foundation in Arkansas where he served as governor. And, but the competition is for places on the board. And since we only have 8 seats for family members, and it is considered their premier institution, the competition is pretty tough. And the nominating committee takes their work very, very seriously and is very candid in conversations about which nieces and nephews or brothers and sisters really have the right character and interests and capacities to serve well as a trustee.
How many members are there alive today
of the family?
Of the family? Do you know?
It's something around, I was thinking about this on the plane coming down, it's around 280.
Right.
So it's a lot, this is a big pyramid at this point
Right.
of direct descendants from John D. Rockefeller.
The issue for foundations that are family foundations primarily about how to pick the successor trustees is a serious one. I mean, think, for example, of the Surdna Foundation, which Ed Sloot was the head of, founded 100 years ago, and now there's several hundred members,
Yeah.
and they've created mechanisms whereby they go through the same kind of process that
Yeah.
you described to try to figure out who's really fit
Yeah.
and who deserves being trustees.
Exactly.
They don't have the same kind of formula. You have, I think, half and half trustees and non-trustees.
Right. The family is so serious about the philanthropic legacy, and in fact, it's really philanthropy that keeps the family together as a family. That's the glue in this large family. It's not business. It's not other kinds of things. It's not politics anymore. It's really philanthropy, and so they take very seriously the process of educating their children and giving them opportunities starting at a young age. And there are family philanthropy committees, and there is a family philanthropy office that helps individual Rockefellers to make their philanthropic contributions from their own resources. And they talk a lot about this, and they write about it, and they think about it, and they have all these other institutions in which family members can sit on boards, nonprofits and a few foundations. And it's through that series of board experiences that people are seen as being ready to serve on a board like the RBF.
So the values of the family also get expressed this way.
Absolutely.
As well.
Absolutely.
And it's important, it has been decisive, I suppose, in the shaping of the program and the evolution of what RBF does.
It is very much so. They've had a marvelous understanding from a very early point in the foundation's history, going back to, I think it was about 1953. So maybe after a decade of very serious work after the war, something like that, where they decided they really wanted non-family members on the board, and they wanted to hire professional staff. And they really have done this in a way that was very egalitarian, in the sense that they do not expect the non-family members on the board to defer to them or their judgments, and they see the staff very much as the leadership of the foundation, in which they are trustees. I mean, they take that responsibility very seriously, but they've always relied on experts. And this goes back to John D. Rockefeller himself, who always felt, you know, the way to try to get to solve a big problem is to bring in the experts and listen to them and do what they think is the right thing to do. There's a wonderful little anecdote about he was getting tens of thousands of personal requests for financial support. And one day he got a letter from an unknown scientist by the name of Albert Einstein, who sent him a letter asking for $500 for some experiment he wanted to do, and he gave it to his then philanthropic advisor, Frederick T. Gates, who said, well, maybe we should do something. Let's give him $500. And Rockefeller looked at it again and he said, you know what? This guy may be onto something. Let's give him 1,000. So they were always relying on expert advice in their philanthropy, again, from the very beginning. And that tradition is why the board is structured the way it is, why we are staffed the way that we are, and how we interact with the family is really quite marvelous, because they don't take a privileged position in this.
It's also interesting that in the whole Rockefeller Brothers Fund is coming up on its 75th anniversary in 2015, and in the whole history of the 75 years, there have been only 4 directors of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which I guess the tenure of foundation presidents maybe have been longer in the past than it is now, but nonetheless, that's almost 4, 20-year terms for all practical purposes. Yeah. And they're all really interesting group, but they got along well with the family. They led and they helped create the remarkable reputation RBF has.
Well, one wonders occasionally whether the family is loyal to a fault, and I keep thinking that to myself and saying, maybe I shouldn't stick around too much longer. It's been 14 years. But my predecessor, whom we both know and love, was there for about 15 or 16 years. And when he announced that he was leaving to go to yet another leadership position in Rockefeller world, which was to be the president of Colonial Williamsburg, the Rockefellers on the board of the RBF thought he had left a little early and were kind of disappointed. So they really are careful about whom they hire, and then they support you to the hilt, and they are extremely loyal to you. And it's a huge privilege.
You know, one of the announcements this year, it was striking, I think, to all of us who follow these foundation kinds of things, when the family decided to divest its investments in petroleum-based products, right?
Yes, well, I need to be very clear here, this was the Rockefeller Brothers Fund deciding to divest, not the entire family. And there were some family members who were not entirely pleased with our decision. Although most were, and I think that's also a remarkable thing in and of itself, given the obvious irony of the Rockefellers divesting from the source of their vast wealth. But it was a very reasoned decision, and it was an institutional decision for us. We are deeply engaged on the issue of climate change, and if you look across all of our domestic and international grant-making portfolios, approximately 50% of all of our grants are related to climate change in some fashion or another, mostly devoted to trying to shift public attitudes and public policy to put in place the kinds of regulations and policy change that we need to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a fairly short period of time and avoid what science tells us will be a series of climate catastrophes if we let global temperatures rise to 2 degrees Celsius above industrial era levels. So a lot of our grant making is going for this, and I became personally more and more uncomfortable with the fact that there we were funding all this work to try to reduce carbon emissions, while our investments were supporting companies that were creating the carbon emissions in the first place. So we started to have a very serious conversation with our investment committee, which is a board committee, but has some non-board members on it, some very senior Wall Street professionals, and the full board about whether we might join a movement to start divesting from investments in fossil fuel companies. And we started this conversation back in pretty much at the beginning of this year, and it took us through August to get comfortable that this was the right thing to do, to get all the stakeholders aligned around the decision, and to then think about the process we would undertake to actually achieve divestment over a period of time, because it's very complex. And we don't want to diminish our overall financial returns, because it is the commitment of this generation of the Rockefeller family to manage our assets so that future generations will also be able to address the needs of their times and engage in their philanthropic interests. So we have to maintain the purchasing power of the assets at a minimum, which means, because we have to give away 5% a year under IRS regulation, that you've got to earn at least 5% plus inflation if you're going to be held at purchasing power parity. So that's kind of tough in these market conditions. And then if you take out, if you move out of a major chunk of the global economy, which is still in fossil fuels, you diminish the range of investment opportunities that you have. So it was a tough decision, a complex decision, but we saw it, and the board saw it, and the family members saw it as a leadership moment. And it was a great, Joel, it was a great, you said earlier that we're not that big a foundation, and that's absolutely true. And so my philosophy has always been, we need to utilize every asset that we have in order to try to punch above our weight. And so that means, yes, our grant dollars, but it also should mean our endowment. It also means our reputation, our brand, our convening capacity, our intellectual capital. We got to muster all of these things to try to advance the mission and goals of the foundation. So we did make the announcement. We knew it was a good story because of the irony. But to tell you the truth, I didn't expect it was going to be the story that it's turned out to be. I am still doing interviews a month later all over the world. I'm doing a television interview for an Australian television station on Friday. And it has created a huge interest, both in the endowment community about how we made the decision and how we're going to go about doing it. And it's also stimulated interest on the investment side of people coming forward to say, we'd like to talk to you about structuring a fund that would be in clean energy technologies and other sustainable kinds of environmentally sustainable technologies and advancements that need the capital. And so it was a symbolic decision. I don't want to pretend that our withdrawal of a few $100 million from fossil fuels is going to change the economy of the fossil fuel world, but the symbolism is not insignificant.
Has there been repercussions among other family-influenced entities like the Rockefeller Foundation? Have they, or Rockefeller University? Or?
Yeah, many of them and several other foundations that you and I both know well that are not connected to the family at all have contacted me to say, this is fascinating and terrific. How did you do it, and what does it mean? And we'd like to at least understand it better, which is great. But it is complex, and it's going to take us 3 or 4 years, I think, to get close to fully divested. We're now down to about 5%, and in the broad equity market, I think the average is about 9 or 10%. So we're getting there, and we're almost entirely out of coal and tar sands oil, which are the two largest sources of greenhouse gas emission of carbon dioxide.
Another example of the family's leadership.
Oops, you lost your microphone.
And I lost my microphone?
You did.
Sorry about that. But that's not important for me to be on there.
Well, it is.
In any event, I'll never get it back in the same place. What I was going to ask you, why don't you do this? Yeah. I can't do it. I could never tie a bow tie for the same reason.
That should do it.
Thank you. Okay. I was going to say, one of the areas, other areas of the RBF's interest has long been Asia, right?
Yes.
I remember, there's a Duke graduate actually, Russell Phillips, who was at Duke undergraduate and Duke Law School graduate, I think, who worked at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund for years, I think just recently retired in the last 2 or 3 years, who was, I think, one of the major Asia hands.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Say
a little bit about the history, given the world focusing on Asia at this point, and America's pivot towards Asia. The Rockefeller family, and both I think through RBF and before RBF actually, was engaged in a variety of activities in Asia.
Yes.
And what's the current manifestation of that?
Yes. Well, the Asia dimension has always been present, as you said, and part of that goes, again, back to the original history. Standard Oil, which Rockefeller founded in 1870 with initial capital of $1 million, by sometime early in the 20th century, and I don't know the exact date, 70% of Standard Oil's business was outside the United States. So it was really the first multinational corporation, he was really the first truly global entrepreneur, and a lot of it was in Asia. He was selling huge quantities of kerosene in China for heating, for illumination, and so a lot of his business was in global markets. And as his grandchildren grew up, several of them kind of inherited this interest in Asia. John D. Rockefeller Jr. became a major collector of Chinese porcelains. And his son, John D. Rockefeller III, kind of became the Asianist of the brothers' generation. And so when he was a founding trustee, it was his interest in Asia that first began to find expression in the work of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And some of the very initial grants of the RBF were actually for war relief activities in China after the Second World War. So Asia has always been very big. Russell Phillips did an extraordinary job of developing the Asia work for the RBF. He retired actually about 10 years ago now. When I arrived at the RBF, my only complaint about our work in Asia, as I began to see it on the ground by traveling there, was that we were spread all over the place. And we were trying to do too many things in too many places with too little money to really have significant impact, although much of the work itself was very good. So as part of a strategic review process that I helped lead the board through over a couple of year period, one of the questions we asked ourselves was, is there a way to have greater impact in Asia? And we thought that maybe by focusing geographically and focusing intellectually, we might achieve better results. And at the end of a very, very interesting process where we looked at a variety of different places where we might go deep, we ended up choosing southern China as our place in Asia. And the reason for southern China is that China is too huge for us. And if you look at modern and ancient Chinese history, you find that a lot of China's development actually begins in the South. Politically, socially, economically, the South has always been, in part because of that old saying, it's over the mountains and far away from the emperor. They were able to experiment, they were able to try different things. They had access to the West through Hong Kong. And so the South is a very dynamic place still today. And so we decided to focus on the South with the thought that if we could help support a process of change in the South and connect it to thinking and work in Beijing, that might have a broader effect on China as a whole. And it's been very exciting. I think we're seeing some progress in that regard. Most of our work is on environmental matters. As you all know, the air pollution in China is horrible. It's largely related to coal, which means that it also is related to carbon emissions and climate change. So our work is all focused on environment and human health, carbon reduction, and climate change. And we are funding projects on the ground, and we are funding research and analysis, and we're funding policy advocacy, and we're working directly with the central leadership in Beijing to connect this together. And I'm very excited about the recent announcement that President Obama and President Xi Jinping made, which occurred 10 days after I happened to be in Beijing meeting with our partners in this climate change work. And it was very clear. I was meeting with very senior officials, including the top Chinese negotiator in the international climate talks. It was very clear that they were still in a very serious debate internally about how far China could go. And there were advocates inside as well as in the NGO community for very ambitious targets, and there were industrial factions and energy factions and others who were arguing for very modest targets. And they all knew ultimately Xi Jinping himself was going to make the decision. And he did, and he made a pretty ambitious target. And a really, his announcement along with President Obama's announcement is really a major, major, kind of historic moment.
Can you speculate a little bit? The first foundations that I know of that were engaged in trying to reduce pollution in China were through the Energy Foundation. Mm-hmm. It may be, this was, I think, if I remember correctly, created in the 1990s, in the early 1990s. Right. A group of foundations came together, created the Energy Foundation, and the Energy Foundation's mission really was to focus on, among other things, reduction of emissions in China. My sense is that they're still going.
They are.
The question really has to do with the degree to which you cooperate with them or with other foundations in joint efforts, because partnerships among foundations have been rare in the past. They seem to be getting more frequent. And I'm just wondering, given your turn towards focusing on China, that part of China with such things as effects on global warming, there must be opportunities there to work together with them.
There are, and we do cooperate, and we do parallel grant making with the Energy Foundation. We have worked very closely with the Oak Foundation. I know somebody is here from
yes.
Oak. We are working with the Hewlett Foundation in China. In fact, we have a wonderful relationship with the Hewlett Foundation. Hewlett is a huge foundation. You probably know their asset size, but it's got to be
$9 billion.
$9 billion, something like that. And they decided they wanted to do some work to support Chinese NGOs who were working on energy and environment and climate, but they felt that they were too big to do it. They make very big grants. One of the legacies of the Hewlett style of philanthropy is to have very, very lean operations and a small staff, which thereby means if you're giving away the amount of money they have to give away, they make pretty big grants. So they couldn't see how they were going to get funds to Chinese organizations because they didn't have the capacity to do it. So they made a grant to us because they liked the work that my colleague does in China with Chinese NGOs. They're giving us about $1.5 million a year for us to re-grant alongside our own dollars to the organizations in China that we support, which is really an unusual relationship and a fantastic relationship. We work with the Ford Foundation in China. We work with other European foundations. And so there's actually a lot more collaboration. And I think this is also essential because, again, the amount of money all of us have is pretty modest compared to the problems we're trying to address.
You and I have talked about this before, and some of you here know about the increasing number of limited life foundations, so-called spend-down foundations, that have been created over the course of the last 20-some years. And there's some momentum there. I'm not sure it's still increasing, but there was, at least at some point, a large number being created. I know that you all, your trustees, have talked about the question of whether RBF should spend down or whether it should remain. And your comments earlier about in your divestment and the investment policies as a result of it suggest that that at least for the time being, the idea really is to continue on as a perpetual foundation unless they decide later they don't want to do that. That's
exactly right. We had a kind of a formal discussion of this some years ago. I think it was in 2007 or 8, and the board adopted a statement on perpetuity. And the statement basically says that it is our goal to operate the foundation today so that it could be in operation in perpetuity for future generations, but that each generation has the right and indeed the obligation to revisit that question and make the determination for themselves of how they think the foundation should be managed. And the debate is between huge, urgent problems that are before us in this world today, and shouldn't we devote all the resources to these things now, especially on something as profound as climate change, as one example, versus not knowing what the challenges and needs may be in the future and wanting to maintain capacity to respond to those. And that's part of the debate. The other part is in families where there isn't this tradition yet. And so it's a question of, do we start a tradition? And do we feel confident that a tradition, in fact, can be started that will maintain the values of the wealth generation, the wealth founding generation itself? And that's an important consideration for a lot of the spending while living donors.
Well, it strikes me that one of the real problems in thinking about how to get the same accountability for impact in the perpetual foundations as one assumes is there in the spend down foundations, because you've got a limited life, and typically the donors establish the foundations with the intention of achieving impact during their lifetime.
Exactly.
And so you get a very interesting tension there in trying to understand how much can reasonably be done in the lifetime of the current generation. And it sounds to me that you all have really sort of tried to create a kind of balance between leaving the decision open for each generation, but at the same time increasing the likelihood that there are going to be assets for each generation to make a decision whether it wants to go on. That says something about the values and the tradition of the family and the role that could play. And I've sensed in looking at a lot of the perpetual foundations that where there is a vibrant family around over several generations, it's a lot easier to get that kind of accountability. And one of the criticisms I've made, and others have too, of the Rockefeller Foundation has been with the absence of having significant family representation on that board, the same kind of moral authority for coherence of the history and the tradition of the foundation hasn't been there from time to time. And somehow it's righted itself under the current leadership. But where you've got family there, as you do, and a number of other of the perpetual foundations do, there's another, there is a source of moral authority for coherence and for trying to keep urgency, a sense of urgency in achieving impact there.
Yeah.
Do you think that's right?
I do. I am a firm believer in diversity of philanthropic form. And so I think the spend down foundations are completely legitimate, and I think the perpetuity foundations also have legitimacy. And it really depends on the values and on the goals of the source of wealth and successive generations, if that's the way the foundation is to be managed. Mike Bloomberg, who is an extraordinary philanthropist, he says his measure of a good philanthropist is when the last check bounces. And he wants to spend, his vast wealth while he's alive, and he's making very big bets on things. And it's going to be very interesting to watch whether that is a style of philanthropy that really has significant impact in what is a relatively short period of time.
Right.
On the other hand, so many of the issues that we face as a global society are very, very long-term issues. They have long antecedents and they stretch long into the future. And I think there's definitely a case to be made for taking the long view and thinking that philanthropy is a necessary part of society going forward, and that we can't necessarily count on future wealth the same way that we've counted on past wealth. So,
we talked a little bit about the emergence of different forms of philanthropy, and you said that you're in favor of all of those. One of the currently active forms, they're advocates for such things as impact investing. Has RBF had a discussion about that? And if so, where is it, to the extent that you can talk about it?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it. Our divestment decision was, in fact, reached in the context of a larger discussion about impact investing. So we've been having a conversation and working on impact investing since about 2004 and 5. And at that point, we weren't doing any real impact investing. If you defined impact investing to mean using your endowment assets and investing them in ways that are consistent with and perhaps can advance your program goals and mission. And we really weren't doing any of that. There was a, kind of a very traditional firewall between the investment committee and the endowment and the grant makers in the foundation. So we started having that conversation with them in 2004 and 5, and the pushback was pretty strong at the time. The investment committee, who had done a great job and our returns were very good, said, no, you nice people, go do all your good things, and your job is to spend the money, and our job is to make the money, and leave us alone. Right. And we weren't entirely satisfied with that. And so I thought maybe the way to begin a more serious conversation was to focus on shareholder activism. Because we are owners of all these stocks, and your shareholder rights are an economic asset. And maybe we should think about how we could at least start deploying those in a way that was consistent with our mission and program goals. So that was a very good conversation. It took a year. We had a committee of the investment committee and some other trustees and staff who spent a year going through a whole series of guidelines for thinking about how we would vote proxies on governance issues, environmental issues, and social issues. And we ended up with a 30-page document, which is still available on our website, which I think is a pretty good piece of work. And we started, instructing our fund managers to vote proxies in accordance with these guidelines. And that was a significant step in itself, but what was the most significant part about it was the educational aspect. It really got a conversation going about what does it mean to invest in a way that is consistent with environmental governance and social concerns. And that got us deeper in the past, so that in 2010, the board adopted a resolution saying that we would invest up to 10% of the value of our assets in investments that were designed to support the clean energy economy, sustainable development, and other things that are consistent with our mission.
That's very different from impact investing as it originally came into vogue, which was to avoid doing harmful things.
Right.
Rather than now, it's really trying to invest in things that will do good things.
That's right.
Right.
Right. And it's hard. We set this goal of 10% and we're not there yet because it's hard to find the investments. It's getting better, but it has been hard to find investments that meet both the overall absolute return goals and the programmatic goals simultaneously. As I said, it is growing, and I think it's going to grow very rapidly. I mean, just this decision, of the Chinese, if they really followed through on it, one of the things Xi Jinping announced was that they were going to convert 20% of their entire energy supply to renewable energies by 2030. That is a huge market that is going to develop. And one thing about the Chinese, when they decide to do something, they do it. And so there's a lot of reason to think this is actually going to happen. And that means huge growth in that industry in China for solar and wind and other renewable energies. And if those investments become available to the global investment community, there's going to be lots of opportunity there. And so I think this is going to grow dramatically. And we are going to get to our 10% goal, but we really want to get beyond that. We really want to increase over the years ahead.
You personally, and I think RBF, has had an interest in civic engagement,
yes,
politics in the United States as well. What are you doing at this point to help remedy the political problems that we're having in our system?
Well, we're not making much progress. That's evident. But we are devoted to it. When we went through the kind of major foundation-wide review process in 2002 and 2003 after I arrived at the fund, and we needed to shrink in the things we were doing. We ended up focusing on 3 themes, and we work on these 3 themes in the US and elsewhere in the world, and those are the only 3 themes we work on. And they are democratic practice, as we call it, which is about trying to strengthen the quality of democracy, sustainable development, which is now almost exclusively energy and climate, and peace building. So 3 very big, very tough issues. Intentionally selected because we see them as being very important, obviously, but also as being really interconnected, that you can't really make progress on one of these without seeing progress in the others. So in the democracy space, most of our grant making, not surprisingly, is focused on the US, where we have very significant democracy deficits at a time. And this is something I care very, very deeply about because, as you noted, Joel, the first 15 years of my career was in politics and government service. I was inspired, like so many in my generation, by John F. Kennedy, by Martin Luther King, by the Vietnam War protests that I participated in, and the sense that one way to solve those kinds of huge societal issues was through politics and public service. And I still believe that. Unfortunately, for a lot of very good reasons of their lived experience, many, many Americans no longer believe that to be the case. And we've lost faith in our institutions. We have lost faith in the political process. We are kind of a pox on both their houses and their Senate. And, and you know, we are at a place of democratic drift and decline. Yeah. And it is tragic, and it is deeply, deeply troubling. So in our case, we've been focusing our grant making largely in 3 areas. 1, trying to get money out of politics. 2, trying to get people into the process by reducing barriers to participation. And 3, trying to strengthen the effectiveness of government itself and the understanding of the role of government in our society. And so those are the 3 streams of our grant making. And in addition, we've been thinking about a kind of larger initiative which we are kind of launching an experimental project which we're calling Pluribus. And Pluribus is designed to get the many back into American politics because what we see is declining participation for, again, reasons of people's lived experience, a sense that they don't have civic or political agency or efficacy. And so with that phenomenon, you have the growing influence and power of special interests and money and the ideological extremes in American politics. So how can we get the many back into our politics? And this is a multi-year effort that we are actually doing in collaboration now with 9 other foundations who are supporting it.
Hewlett, is this what Larry Kramer started?
Hewlett, actually, this is something we started. He started at something else.
Right.
But we started this Pluribus thing, and they're contributing to it, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford, Open Society, and we have we're incubating it at the RBF, but it will become independent at some point along the way. And it's designed to experiment with 2 sets of activities. One is to gather and tell in powerful ways the stories of civic agency that do exist. Because as you all know in this room, there are millions of American citizens who are doing things in their communities and changing conditions on the ground. And they are doing it selflessly, they are doing it effectively. Sometimes it's through influencing the political process, sometimes it's through volunteer activity, through churches, other things, but people are engaged. And yet those stories don't get told. And so you have the national narrative of dysfunction and hyperpartisanship and institutional decline on the one hand, and yet this rich array of civic agency, and the 2 don't get connected. So one of the things we want to work on is how can we gather these kinds of stories and share them through very powerful storytellers, using all the media and types that are now available to us, to kind of try to create a countervailing narrative about what civic life can be and what change can occur and how individuals working together in community can accomplish important things. And hope to begin to kind of get people to think again, you know what, we don't have to have a national political culture like the one we have. This is not the America we grew up believing in and thinking about. It's not the one we want our kids to enjoy, and we can change it, and we have to change it. So that's a long-term effort. And the second dimension, which is even more experimental, is thinking about ways to disrupt the current practice of political campaigns in order, again, to try to bring citizen voices more directly into the campaign experience as opposed to the mostly moneyed voices.
What kinds of practical aspects of that have you thought about?
Well, we've got a couple of experiments. It's interesting. We've been consulting with the campaign consultants. So there's a whole industry,
yes,
you know, of campaign consultants who work for Republicans and Democrats, and they're strategists and they're media specialists, and now, of course, the big data, you know, specialists and experts who devise all these things to help candidates win. But the net effect of all of that is actually you win by narrowing the electorate.
Right.
You win by getting to a very narrow group and energizing them to get to the polls, as opposed to getting to the broad electorate, energizing them to engage in the debate, and inspiring them to be part of the process. So it's interesting, even though some of these hard, tough political consultants of the type I used to work with when I was even a candidate for office have grown very cynical about all of this. And, but some of them have also begun to see that this is not so healthy.
Yeah.
And they are less and less comfortable about their place in all of it.
Interesting.
And so they are willing to work with us to think about some experiments that we might help support over the next few campaign cycles, to see if we can recruit some candidates who kind of sign up to a code of conduct and a style of campaigning that would be pretty different than a lot of what we see in the mainstream of electoral politics today. And we'll see how it goes.
I think that's very exciting. Could you crystallize the difference between what the group that Hewlett, Kramer,
Yes.
has begun to catalyze,
Yes.
and what Pluribus is?
So what Larry Kramer did is he became president of Hewlett was to say, and I really applaud him for this, to say, you know, I'm a new foundation president, I've never worked in philanthropy before. It seems to me that foundations ought to be collaborating more than they do. And a lot of us said, yes, you're right, and we've been trying too. It's just not so easy, as Hotting knows, and as Joel knows. It's very, very hard for a lot of reasons we can get into. But those of us who were working, and he wanted to focus on how to revitalize American democracy. So he had a very welcome partner in me and a handful of others, and we are meeting the presidents and their program leaders in the democracy space are meeting on a regular basis. And we have jointly funded some research. We want to understand what money is going into various activities to try to strengthen the practice of American democracy. So we commissioned the Foundation Center to do a deep dive on that data, which was extremely interesting. At the highest level, what it showed was if American foundations are giving away something like $45 billion now annually, only about $1 billion of it is related to trying to strengthen our democracy. Yeah. And when you think about it, all the other issues foundations really care about, any of them that have any relationship to public policy, are being held back because of the dysfunctional political system. So part of the goal of this group that Larry helped convene is to try to get more foundations to participate, even those foundations who don't have a program related to democracy. So we're going to go to the environmental funders and say, you are concerned about the environment, you're absolutely right, but you know you're not going to achieve your environmental goals with a political scene that is as broken as the one we've got. Why don't you, give 1% to a fund that will be used for strengthening democracy? We want to build up the resources. The second thing we're doing as a group is we've commissioned research on, we want to look at 3 or 4 key democracy reforms, like public financing of campaigns, which some states have now enacted, election day registration, which some states have enacted, and online voter registration, which some states have enacted, and study the effects of those collectively. And if the research suggests that those reforms actually are constructive and create progress, then think about the next set of states and together fund activity that would try to promote those reforms in another tier of states. Yeah. Over time, keep adding more states. Right. And this is what happened, by the way, with marriage equality. Right. A number of very strategic funders and advocates got together and they looked at the state kind of map and picked out the states where they thought they would have the best chance of early success, and then kept picking more states. And the idea was that ultimately they were going to pick enough states that they would have a majority of the American population having supported marriage equality. And that's what they did. And I mean, it just is a remarkable story of how quickly this country went from where we were to where we are today is a great example of organizing, of nonprofits really being strategic and creative and courageous, and funders working to support that.
Reminds me, incident, there are many examples, like, for example, what the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has done, for example, in state-by-state initiatives designed to reduce smoking by teenagers.
Absolutely.
So we're going to stop the formal presentation now because we're going to lose our videographer, and since we don't ever record the question and answer period anyway, but we'll move on to now. Thank you very much.